The story really began with the uncle, a man who lived in a quiet neighborhood, where most people thought of him as just another homeowner with a calm personality and a private lifestyle. To the outside world, he looked like an ordinary man who enjoyed gardening, reading old history books, and taking long walks by the river. He never went out of his way to impress anyone, and he certainly didn't talk about his job much. If anyone asked, he would simply say he'd worked for the government, then politely change the subject. What very few people knew was that this calm, quiet man was actually a federal judge, someone who had spent decades making some of the most important decisions in the courtroom. The uncle had worked hard his whole life and had built his property into a place that was both peaceful and useful. One of the most special parts of his land was a bridge. It wasn't just any bridge. It was a small but strong wooden bridge that connected his property to a public trail. Over time, it became more than a shortcut. It was the kind of bridge kids loved running across in the summer, the kind of place couples would stop and take photos, and the kind of spot where people would stand quietly just to watch the river flow underneath. Some neighbors called it a landmark, though the uncle himself always laughed and said it was just a bridge. The bridge had history. Decades ago, when the uncle first decided to have it built, he went through every step by the book. He had permits, environmental approvals, and inspections. The design was carefully chosen so it wouldn't harm the natural flow of the river or disturb wildlife in the area. For him, the bridge was part of a bigger vision, making his property accessible, while also keeping it connected to the community and nature. People in the neighborhood sometimes stopped to talk about the bridge. They admired how solid it looked, even after years of rain and storms. Some even used it when they went jogging on the nearby trail. But while many saw it as a small gift to the community, there was one group that didn't see it, that weighed it. Homeowners Association, or HOA. The HOA in this neighborhood had a reputation. Everyone joked about how strict they were, but the jokes usually came with a sigh or an eye roll. They would complain about the color of someone's front door, send warning letters about grass that grew a little too tall, and argue over whether Christmas decorations were too bright or not uniform with community standards. Most people tried to avoid trouble with them, but it was hard. The board members seemed to thrive on control. The uncle wasn't the type to get into arguments with them. In fact, for years he had very little contact with the HOA. He paid his dues on time, kept his yard neat, and lived peacefully. But the bridge. That bridge became a point of quiet irritation for the HOA board. It started with little whispers during community meetings. A board member once asked, who gave him permission to build that bridge? Someone else answered, I don't think the HOA ever approved it. They talked as if the bridge had popped up overnight, as if the uncle had dragged planks of wood to the river and built it in secret. None of them seemed to realize that the bridge had been there longer than some of the current residents had lived in the neighborhood. Still, the whispers grew louder. They started sending letters, each one written in stiff, official language. The first letter simply said the bridge might be non-compliant with community guidelines. The uncle read it, sighed, and calmly wrote back. Included copies of the permits, documents that proved the county and even federal offices had approved the construction decades ago. He thought that would end the matter, but the HOA wasn't satisfied. A few weeks later, another letter arrived. This time they claimed the bridge was unsightly and out of harmony with the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Again, the uncle wrote back politely, pointing out that the bridge was not. Even within the HOA's authority, since it connected to public land and had been approved before many of the HOA rules even existed, he reminded them, without anger, that they had no legal grounds to challenge it. Neighbors started to notice the tension. Some whispered among themselves, saying things like, why are they going after him? He's done nothing wrong. Others said that bridge has been there forever. It's practically part of the town. But a few sided with the HOA, not because they hated the bridge, but because they feared crossing the board. Everyone knew the HOA could make your life miserable if you got on their bad side. Through all of this, the uncle stayed calm. He didn't brag about his position as a judge. He didn't raise his voice. He simply trusted that reason and law would eventually silence the HOA. But deep down, his nephew, the one telling this story, could sense the storm building. The HOA was the kind of group that hated losing, even when they were clearly in the wrong. And the uncle's quiet resistance only seemed to provoke them further. The bridge itself almost seemed to reflect the situation. On sunny days it stood there peacefully, a symbol of connection and calm. But on stormy days, when rain poured down and the river rushed underneath, the bridge seemed like a line of defiance, holding strong against pressure. It was as if the bridge had its own personality, a quiet strength just like its owner, the nephew. Often visited his uncle and loved walking across the bridge. He could see how much it meant to him, not just as a piece of property, but as a piece of history, effort, and pride. He also noticed how the uncle never bragged about his legal knowledge or his power as a judge. He preferred to be known as the man with the bridge, not the man with the gavel. But the HOA didn't see the bigger picture. They didn't see the history, the effort, or the meaning. To them, it was about control. The bridge was something they hadn't approved, something outside of their grasp, and that made them furious. And while the uncle thought he had put the matter to rest with his polite letters and proof, the truth was that the HOA was only just beginning their campaign against him. At first glance, part one of this story looks calm, almost ordinary. A man, his bridge, his quiet life. But underneath, the tension is building. The bridge isn't just wood and nails. It's a symbol. The uncle isn't just a quiet man with a nice property. He's someone with far more power than the HOA could ever imagine, they thought. We're picking a fight with an ordinary homeowner? They had no idea that they were pushing against a man who had spent his entire life upholding the law. A man who believed in justice more deeply than anything else. For now, though, he kept that part of himself hidden. To his neighbors, he was just the man with the bridge. The HOA, blinded by arrogance, believed they could push him around like anyone else. And as the nephew watched events unfold, began to realize that what seemed like a small neighborhood dispute was about to turn into something much bigger. The HOA had been restless for weeks, and the bridge was at the center of every conversation they had. It didn't matter that the uncle had already provided them with all the documents they asked for: permits, approvals, even the old stamped papers that showed the county had cleared the construction decades ago. None of that mattered to them because the real issue wasn't safety or legality, it was control. The board members were used to being the final authority in the neighborhood. They were used to people nodding, apologizing, and changing things the moment they demanded it. But the uncle wasn't like that. He didn't argue, but he didn't bend either. And to them, that was unacceptable. It started with more letters. One thick white envelope after another arrived in his mailbox, each stamped with the HOA's letterhead. Some were written in stiff legal language, warning of fines for non-compliance. Others sounded almost childish, saying things like the bridge does not match the community aesthetic, or the HOA was not properly consulted and therefore cannot approve its presence. The uncle responded to each one patiently. He kept a file in his study with every letter and his calm, polite replies. Each reply included proof, copies of permits, photographs, and even maps, showing how the bridge wasn't even under HOA authority, since part of it extended onto public land. But the more he proved them wrong, the more determined they became. At their monthly meetings, the bridge became the main topic. Neighbors who attended would hear the HOA president raising her voice, waving papers around and saying things like, "This bridge is a liability. If someone gets hurt on it, the whole neighborhood will be responsible." Another board member chimed in once, saying, "It sets a bad precedent. If we let him have a bridge, what's next? People will start building whatever they want." The room would usually split in silence. A few people quietly agreed with the uncle, but most didn't dare speak up. Everyone knew that crossing the HOA was like painting a target on your back. Meanwhile, the uncle stayed calm. He never missed a day of his quiet routines. He tended to his garden, walked his dog across the bridge, and occasionally stopped to talk with neighbors who admired the view. His nephew noticed how steady he was, as if none of the HOA's threats bothered him. But in private, he would sometimes shake his head and say softly, "They don't understand. They think this is about rules." But the bridge has more standing in law than their entire HOA. One day a neighbor came by, a man named Peter, who often went jogging across the trail that connected to the bridge. He warned the uncle in a hushed voice, "I overheard them last night. They're planning something bigger. They're not going to stop with letters." The uncle thanked him, but his expression didn't change much. He simply said the law will always outlast temper tantrums. Still, his nephew could see a flicker in his eyes, as if he was preparing for the storm he knew was coming. The HOA began to escalate. Instead of just sending letters, they started coming to his property. At first, it was small, an HOA board member standing at the edge of his driveway, clipboard in hand, pretending to inspect the surroundings. Then came warnings taped to his door, bright orange slips with words like "Final Notice" printed in bold letters. They even sent an email to the entire neighborhood claiming the bridge was unsafe and dangerous, even though the county had recently inspected it and declared it perfectly fine. The uncle wrote back again, this time more firmly, told him that spreading false information could amount to defamation, and that trespassing on his property without notice was a violation of state law. He still didn't mention who he was. He didn't mention the courtroom where he had spent his life, or the hundreds of cases he had presided over. He kept that part of himself hidden, as he always did. To the HOA, he was just a stubborn old man who refused to listen. The HOA president, however, was not the type to back down. She thrived on power, and the fact that the uncle didn't flinch at her threats drove her into a kind of obsession. She held side meetings with other board members, whispering about how they had to take matters into their own hands. Board member asked nervously, "What if he sues? What if we're wrong?" But the president brushed it off, saying, "What can he do? He's just one man. The HOA represents the whole neighborhood." She truly believed the weight of the HOA gave her authority over everything within sight. The nephew, watching all of this, began to notice the way neighbors were choosing sides. Some were sympathetic, quietly telling the uncle they supported him, but asking him not to use their names if things escalated. Others avoided eye contact altogether, afraid of getting dragged into the fight. And a few, mostly those who were close to the HOA board, started treating the uncle differently, crossing the street instead of waving or muttering things about rules under their breath. The neighborhood that once felt calm was slowly dividing, all because of a bridge. One afternoon, the uncle received yet another letter, but this one was different. Instead of a fine or a warning, it was a notice. The HOA claimed they had authority to have the bridge remove themselves if he didn't take it down within 30 days. They gave him a deadline in bold letters, stamped with their seal. His nephew read the letter and felt anger boiling inside him. "They can't do this," he said, his voice shaking. "They don't own the land. They don't have any power over this bridge. They're lying." But the uncle only folded the paper neatly and placed it in his file. His calmness was almost frustrating. "They're bluffing," he said quietly. "But if they're foolish enough to act on it, that will be their mistake to live with." Still, the nephew noticed his uncle taking more photographs of the bridge, carefully documenting every angle. He even called in a county surveyor to recheck the property lines and file an updated report. He was preparing, even if he didn't say it out loud. The tension grew with each passing day. The HOA stopped pretending to be civil. Their emails to the neighborhood became harsher, describing the bridge as an illegal structure and warning that legal action would follow if it wasn't gone soon. The uncle's mailbox filled with papers. The board even sent a man in a bright vest to measure near the bridge, though he quickly left when the uncle walked up and asked for his credentials. It was clear now that the HOA had no intention of letting this go. The bridge had become a symbol to them, a challenge to their authority. And in their minds, if they couldn't win this fight, then every other homeowner might start resisting them too. They couldn't allow that. What they didn't realize was that they weren't just dealing with another homeowner. They weren't dealing with someone who was afraid of fines or warnings. They were dealing with a man who had spent his entire life inside courtrooms, a man who knew the law better than anyone else in the neighborhood. As they saw him as an ordinary obstacle to be pushed aside, but he was much more than that. The uncle remained patient, but his nephew could sense the storm tightening. The letters, the warnings, the threats, all of it was leading towards something. The HOA believed they were in control, that their final notice would scare the uncle into giving up. But they had no idea what kind of mistake they were about to make. And so, as the 30-day deadline approached, the neighborhood buzzed with tension. Some people whispered that the uncle might give in and remove the bridge himself to avoid trouble. Others speculated that the HOA would finally send in workers to tear it down. Nobody knew exactly what would happen, but everyone could feel that something big was coming. The uncle kept his calm smile, but even his silence carried a weight that made his nephew uneasy. The bridge stood there every day, quietly, like a line drawn in the sand. And the HOA, blind with arrogance, was preparing to cross it. It was early in the morning when the sound of heavy engines echoed through the neighborhood. The uncle's nephew had stayed over that night, and he was the first to wake up. At first, he thought it was just a garbage truck or some construction nearby, but when he peeked through the curtains, his stomach dropped. Big machines, trucks, and men in hard hats were lining up near the uncle's property. The HOA had made their move. The uncle was still in the kitchen, calmly making his coffee, when the nephew rushed in, his voice shaking. "They're here. They brought machines." For a moment, the uncle didn't respond, simply stirred his coffee, then placed the spoon neatly on the counter. "So," he said softly, "they've decided to cross the line." Without rushing, he put on his shoes and stepped outside. The sight was shocking. A group of contractors, clearly hired by the HOA, were already setting up equipment. A yellow backhoe was parked near the edge of the property, its claw arm raised like a weapon. The HOA president stood nearby with a clipboard in hand, her face filled with smug satisfaction. She wore sunglasses, even though the sun was barely up, and she barked orders at the workers as if she were running the entire town. The uncle walked calmly toward them. "This is private property," he said, his voice firm but not loud. "You have no authority to be here." The HOA president didn't even look at him at first. She waved her hand at the workers. "Don't listen to him." He was given notice. The deadline passed. "We're enforcing community standards." The contractors looked uncertain. One of them paused, wiping sweat from his forehead, and asked, "Are you sure we're cleared for this?" "We don't want trouble," the president snapped back. "You're being paid. Do your job." By then, neighbors had started gathering. People peeked out of their windows, some coming outside to watch. A few whispered to each other, "Are they really tearing it down?" Others shook their heads in disbelief. The uncle stepped closer, his face calm but his tone sharper now. "You are trespassing. You are damaging private and federally permitted property. If you continue, you will be held personally responsible for every piece you touch." The president smirked, pulling a folded paper from her clipboard. "We have the authority. This bridge is non-compliant. You had your chance. Now it's coming down." She waved the paper in his face like it was a shield. The uncle didn't even reach for it. He simply looked at her with eyes that were steady, almost piercing. "That paper," he said slowly, "means nothing outside of your meetings. It has no legal weight." But she refused to back down. "Start now," she barked at the workers. And with that, the machines roared to life. The sound was deafening. The claw of the backhoe swung forward, digging into the wood of the bridge. With a crack and a groan, part of the railing splintered and fell into the water below. Neighbors gasped. "Ow!" A few shouted, "You can't do this." But the HOA president ignored them, standing tall with her arms crossed. The nephew's hands clenched into fists. He wanted to run forward, to stop them, but the uncle placed a hand on his shoulder. "Not yet," he said softly. "Let them dig their own hole." More pieces of the bridge came crashing down. The workers looked nervous, glancing at each other. But the HOA president kept yelling over the sound of breaking wood. "Faster! Get it done before he calls the county." The uncle calmly pulled out his phone and began recording. He filmed the machines, the workers, the president giving orders. Every crack of wood, every splash into the river was captured. He took photos too, his face steady, as if this was exactly what he expected. By now, nearly half the neighborhood had gathered. Some people were shouting at the HOA. Others stood frozen in disbelief. An older woman from down the street yelled, "This is madness. That bridge has been here for years." But the president snapped back. It was never authorized. "We are fixing the mistake." The destruction continued. Planks of wood that had stood for decades were ripped apart in minutes. The river below filled with debris, the once beautiful bridge now looking like a ruin. Children who often played near the trail stood wide-eyed, clutching their parents. hands. The sound of the machines mixed with the angry shouts of neighbors until it felt like the whole street was a battlefield. Finally, the uncle stepped forward again, his voice carrying across the chaos. "You've made your choice," he said. "Every action you take from this moment forward is a crime, and you will answer for it." The HOA president laughed, though her laugh sounded more forced than confident. "We'll see about that." HOA always wins. But some of the contractors were no longer convinced. One man shut off his machine and climbed down. "Ma'am, I don't like this," he said. "This doesn't feel legal." Another worker nodded, looking uneasy, but the president glared at them. "You stop now, and you don't get paid." It's that simple. The nephew could see it in their faces. They were trapped between money and conscience. A few kept working reluctantly, but their movements slowed, their eyes darting nervously toward the uncle who stood there like a stone pillar, silent but powerful. By the time they finally pulled back, the bridge was ruined. The railing was gone, planks were shattered, and part of the support beams had collapsed into the water. The once sturdy landmark looked like it had been through a war. The HOA president smiled as if she had won a great victory. She turned to the crowd and said, "This is what happens when you ignore the rules." The crowd didn't cheer. Instead, there was a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of the river rushing past the broken beams. Neighbors shook their heads, some whispering angrily, others looking fearful about what would happen next. The uncle didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply put his phone back into his pocket, turned to the workers, and said clearly, "Thank you for documenting this for me." The contractors exchanged confused looks, not understanding what he meant. The HOA president scoffed, rolling her eyes, but his nephew understood. Every photo, every video, every witness standing there, that was all the uncle needed. He didn't need to stop them with his hands. He would stop them with something far stronger. The HOA president strutted off with her clipboard, proud of herself, while the crowd slowly dispersed. Some neighbors came up to the uncle, whispering their support, saying things like, "I'm so sorry. This is wrong," or "They went too far." He only nodded and thanked them, still calm, still collected. As the machines left and the dust settled, the nephew looked at the ruins of the bridge and felt his heart ache. But when he turned to his uncle, he didn't see defeat. He saw quiet, fire in his eyes. The kind of fire that didn't burn fast and wild, but slow and steady, like coals waiting for the right moment to ignite. The HOA thought they had one. They thought destroying the bridge was the end of the story, but in truth, it was only the beginning. The uncle had let them cross the line completely, and now they were standing on the wrong side of the law. They had no idea who they had just gone up against, and by the time they found out, it would already be too late. The days after the destruction of the bridge felt heavy in the neighborhood. People couldn't stop talking about it. Some whispered in hushed voices, as if they were afraid the HOA might overhear, while others spoke loudly, calling it outrageous. The once peaceful trail by the river now looked strange and broken, the debris of the bridge still floating in the water. Children who used to play there stood quietly, pointing at the wreckage with sad faces. Everyone knew the HOA had gone too far, but no one knew exactly what would happen next. The uncle didn't say much during those first few days. He went about his routine as if nothing had happened, watering his plants, reading on the porch, and walking his dog. But beneath his calm expression, his nephew could tell something was different. There was a sharpness in his eyes, like a man who had been patient for too long and was now simply waiting for the right moment to act, inside his study. He spent hours going through documents, pulled out the file he had been keeping for years. Permits, the inspection reports, the old county approvals, and even the federal paperwork. He added new pages, too. Photographs of the destroyed bridge, videos he had recorded while the machines tore it apart, and written statements from neighbors who had witnessed everything. He wasn't rushing, but he was thorough. Every detail was carefully organized, every piece of evidence lined up as if he were preparing for something far bigger than an HOA dispute. The HOA board, on the other hand, behaved as if they had already won. The president strutted around the neighborhood with pride, telling people, "We handled it. The bridge was a hazard, and now it's gone. The community is safer." She sent out a newsletter claiming credit for resolving a long-standing issue, even including photos of the machines tearing the bridge down as proof of their decisive action. Some residents were shocked by the arrogance, but few dared to speak out openly. But the uncle wasn't moved by their words. He knew something they didn't. The bridge wasn't just a personal project. It wasn't just wood and nails sitting on his land. It had federal approval tied to conservation work done years ago. Part of the bridge had been built with funding from a program meant to protect waterways and provide safe crossings for both people and wildlife. It had environmental clearance that placed it under federal oversight, which meant that destroying it wasn't just petty vandalism. It was a serious federal crime. The nephew only discovered this one evening when he asked, "Rebuild it yourself." The uncle gave him a small smile and shook his head. "No, this time it won't be me rebuilding it. It will be the government. And the ones who tore it down will pay for every piece they destroyed." That was when the nephew realized just how deep the trouble was for the HOA. They hadn't just overstepped their authority. They had walked straight into a storm they couldn't escape. A week later, the first letters arrived not from the HOA, but to the HOA. Certified mail, sealed with official government stamps, delivered directly to each board member's home. Neighbors whispered when they saw the delivery. Some thought they were just routine notices, but soon the truth spread like wildfire. The HOA board members were being summoned to court. The president tried to put on a brave face. At the next HOA meeting, she stood up and told everyone, "It's just a misunderstanding. We'll handle it." But her voice cracked slightly, and for the first time, people noticed the nervous tapping of her fingers on the table. The confidence that once made her seem untouchable was slipping. Behind closed doors, panic was setting in. The board members began turning on each other. One said, "You told us we had authority." Others shouted, "You pushed us into this. I didn't even want to bring in the contractors." They argued late into the night, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done. The contractors themselves were furious. They had been told the HOA had the right to order the demolition, but now they realized they had been misled. One contractor sent the uncle a letter apologizing, saying, "We were told it was approved. If we had known, we never would have touched it." Some even hinted they might sue the HOA for dragging them into illegal work. The nephew watched as everything began to unravel. The once feared HOA was suddenly exposed. Their threats and warnings, their fines and notices, none of it mattered anymore. They weren't the authority in this fight. The law was, and the law was on the uncle's side. Soon, federal investigators arrived. They walked along the riverbank, taking notes and photographs of the destroyed bridge. They asked neighbors what they had seen. Some residents eagerly told them everything, while others looked nervous, as if afraid of being dragged into the mess. But it was too late for fear. The truth was already clear. The uncle didn't boast about what was happening. He didn't gloat to his neighbors or confront the HOA president in public. He stayed as calm as ever, though his nephew could see the quiet satisfaction in his eyes. He knew justice was moving, slowly but surely, and there was no stopping it. When word spread that the uncle was a federal judge, the neighborhood was stunned. People who had lived beside him for years suddenly saw him differently. "I had no idea," whispered one woman to her friend. All this time, he was one of the most powerful men in the state. The HOA board members were the most shocked. Of all, they had treated him like just another homeowner they could bully, never realizing he had more authority than they could ever dream of. The news spread quickly outside the neighborhood, too. A local newspaper picked up the story, "HOA tears down legally protected bridge, faces federal charges." Soon it wasn't just gossip, it was public knowledge. The HOA board's names were printed in articles, their actions described in detail. They weren't just facing angry neighbors anymore. They were facing public humiliation. Court dates were set. Each board member had to appear, not as community leaders, but as defendants. They were questioned about their decision-making, about the letters they sent, about the meeting where they decided to take action. Every smug word, every arrogant step they had taken now became evidence against them. The uncle's videos and photographs were presented as proof, showing the destruction from start to finish. Witnesses from the neighborhood stood up and told, the court exactly what they had seen. The board members tried to defend themselves. They said they thought they had authority. They claimed they were protecting the neighborhood. But none of it mattered. The law was clear. Their ignorance was no excuse. The nephew sat in the courtroom during those hearings, watching his uncle remain steady and composed. He didn't raise his voice, didn't attack anyone. He simply presented the facts with the calm authority of a man who lived and breathed justice. Watching him there, the nephew felt proud. This wasn't just about a bridge anymore. It was about respect. About showing that no one was above the law, not even a powerful HOA board. By the time the hearings were over, it was clear the HOA was finished. The president looked pale and exhausted, her once confident tone now reduced to quiet stammers. Some board members openly cried as they realized the fines, lawsuits, and possible criminal charges waiting for them. They had thought they were punishing a stubborn neighbor. Instead, they had destroyed federally protected property and lied to contractors, neighbors, and even themselves. The neighborhood that once seemed divided now leaned heavily toward the uncle's side. People who had been silent before came up to him, apologizing for not speaking sooner and thanking him for standing his ground. Some even admitted they had been afraid of the HOA for years, but now that fear was gone. The illusion of their power had been shattered. The uncle, however, never rubbed it in. He never said, "I told you so." Instead, he only reminded his nephew one evening, power is not in shouting or threatening. Power is in knowing when to act and letting the truth speak for itself. The HOA board thought they had buried the uncle under the ruins of his bridge. What they didn't know was that they had actually dug their own graves. And now, one by one, they were falling into the hole they created. The fallout from the bridge destruction was unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. What the HOA president thought would be a show of power turned into the exact opposite. Instead of standing taller, the board collapsed under the weight of their own arrogance. Everywhere people went in grocery stores, at the park, in community chats, the topic was the same: the bridge and the mess the HOA had created. The neighborhood, once quiet and ordinary, was now the center of attention. The federal case moved forward, and it was no longer something the HOA could hide or downplay. Newspapers wrote about it, local TV stations covered the hearings, and even radio shows mentioned the story. It wasn't just about a bridge anymore. It was about abuse of power. It was about a small group thinking they were bigger than the law. And every time the uncle's name came up, people were surprised to hear that the man who had been living so quietly among them all this time was a federal judge. Suddenly, the picture became clear. The HOA had picked a fight they couldn't possibly win. The board members faced fines so large they could hardly believe the numbers. The federal government required them to pay for the full cost of rebuilding the bridge as well as damages for violating environmental protections. On top of that, lawsuits piled up, contractors suing the HOA for misleading them, neighbors suing for misuse of community funds, and even residents demanding refunds for the dues that had been wasted on this disaster. The HOA's bank account drained faster than anyone thought possible. What had once been a powerful board that sent threats and fines to everyone else was now drowning in its own debts. Neighbors who once feared the HOA now began speaking openly against it. People demanded the resignation of the president and the board members who had supported the demolition. At a community meeting, the room was packed tighter than it had ever been. Dozens of residents stood up one by one, shouting over each other, accusing the board of embarrassing the entire neighborhood. The president tried to defend herself, but the shouting drowned her out. By the end of the night, most of the board had walked out, their faces red, their authority shattered. The uncle didn't attend that meeting. He didn't need to. He knew the HOA was already finished, and he preferred to stay out of the yelling and finger-pointing. Instead, he sat on his porch that evening with his nephew, drinking tea, listening to the sound of the river flowing past the broken remains of his bridge. His calmness hadn't changed, even though everything around him was turning upside down. The government contractors arrived a month later to begin rebuilding the bridge. This time, the project was funded and overseen directly by federal authorities. Trucks delivered supplies, engineers came to inspect the land, and workers began carefully clearing the river of the broken wood the HOA's machines had left behind. Neighbors stood watching as the process unfolded, amazed at the scale of it. The uncle would occasionally walk down to check their progress, speaking politely with the engineers, asking questions and nodding at their answers. He never once acted like he was the one in charge, even though everyone knew the project wouldn't be happening without his quiet push behind the scenes, the nephew noticed. How different the workers were compared to the contractors the HOA had hired. These men weren't nervous or hurried. They worked with patience, precision, and respect, treating the bridge as something valuable, not something to be ripped apart. And slowly, piece by piece, the new bridge began to take shape. It was stronger, wider, and built with better materials than the old one. What the HOA had destroyed in arrogance was now returning. Not only restored, but improved. The day the new bridge was completed, the entire neighborhood gathered to watch the ribbon cutting. The uncle stood near the back of the crowd, not drawing attention to himself. An official from the federal agency gave a short speech about the importance of preserving community landmarks and respecting the law. When he mentioned the uncle's role in protecting the bridge, people turned and looked at him, clapping and cheering. The uncle smiled politely, gave a small nod, and stayed silent. He didn't need the applause. Children were the first to run across the new bridge, their laughter echoing across the water. Families followed, some stopping in the middle to take photos. The bridge was more than wood and nails again. It was a symbol, not just of connection but of justice. Neighbors who had once been divided now shared a moment of unity, standing together on something that had survived arrogance, destruction, and a battle for control. The HOA, however, never recovered. The president resigned in disgrace, moving away quietly a few months later. Other board members stepped down too, some facing personal financial ruin from the lawsuits. A new HOA board was eventually formed, but it was weak, stripped of most of its power. The residents demanded rules that limited what the board could do, making sure nothing like the bridge disaster could ever happen again. For years, people in the neighborhood would bring up the story. It became a kind of legend told to new residents. As a warning, don't underestimate the quiet man with the bridge. The HOA that once scared everyone was now remembered as the group that destroyed itself by trying to destroy something they didn't understand, the nephew. Looking back on it, realized something important. The uncle had never raised his voice, never thrown threats, never tried to scare anyone. He had simply trusted in the truth and in the law. He had allowed the HOA to expose themselves, to dig their own holes so deep they couldn't climb out. Watching him, the nephew learned that real strength wasn't in shouting the loudest, but in knowing when to act and when to stay silent. One evening, months after the new bridge had been completed, the nephew and his uncle stood together at the center of it. The river flowed calmly beneath them, carrying away the last traces of the chaos that had happened there. The uncle placed his hand on the railing, looking out at the water, and said quietly, "They thought they could take this away, but some things can't be destroyed. Justice always finds its way back." The nephew nodded, feeling the weight of those words. He understood now that the bridge was more than just a structure. It was a lesson, a reminder that arrogance eventually collapses, that lies eventually unravel, and that truth, no matter how quietly it stands, always outlasts noise. From that day forward, the neighborhood was never the same. People were kinder, more respectful, and far less willing to let a handful of board members control their lives. The uncle went back to his quiet routines, content to let the story live in whispers and memories. He didn't need to tell it. The bridge told it for him. Every time someone crossed it, they walked across more than wood. They walked across the proof that justice, once set in motion, could never be stopped. The HOA had torn down a bridge thinking they were destroying a man's pride.
What?
They didn't realize was that they had destroyed themselves instead. And in the end, the bridge stood again, stronger and taller than before. A permanent reminder of the price of arrogance and the quiet strength of a man who never needed to raise his voice to win.